relatively early in Sense and Sensibility, the narrator introduces Sir John Milton, who we come to know as a sportsman and an individual who has a tendency to be, well, a bit forward or even uncouth at times. He's also quite generous, and we learn that he delighted in collecting about him more young people than his house would hold, and the noisier they were, the better was he pleased. He was a blessing to all the juvenile part of the neighborhood, for in summer he was forever forming parties to eat cold ham and chicken out of doors, and in winter his private balls were numerous enough for any young lady who was not suffering under the insatiable appetite of 15. I have always been rather taken by Sir John. I'm not sure I exactly admire him, and finding the exact words may be a bit tough here, but I do appreciate how he enjoys and indeed invites others to enjoy the pleasures he finds in life. He loves a house full of young people, is not at all bothered by the noise and chaos they create, and he appears perpetually willing to feed and entertain his guests. He strikes me as such a good time, and he certainly loves a good time. He is at once a minor character in Sense and Sensibility who has relatively little stage time, so to speak, and a crucial character who enacts vital features of the plot. He, of course, invites the Dashwood family to reside at Barton Cottage when they must leave Norland Park, and later we learn that he is the person responsible for informing the disgraced Willoughby about Marianne's illness and convalescence at Cleveland, setting up his dramatic conversation with Eleanor while his sister's life still wavers. I don't think we pay much critical attention to Sir John, but I want to begin this episode of Jane Austen and the Future of the Humanities by thinking more about how he functions in Sense and Sensibility, and what we may be able to learn from this function. Sir John is a rather messy character. He's fond of chaos and noise. He is himself rather loud. He's pretty good at creating messy situations, and perhaps most importantly, he doesn't find discomfort or dis-ease with the messiness of human life. He may even find energy or verve in different kinds of mess. When the Dashwood family arrive at Barton, he welcomes them with great spirit. Austen's narrator tells us that a new family in the country was always a matter of joy to him, and in every point of view he was charmed with the inhabitants he had now procured for his cottage at Barton. Sir John is thrilled to add to his community. He will have more young people to collect about him, make noise, and attend his outdoor parties and winter balls. This all seems a little chaotic to me, if I'm honest. As anyone who has parented, taught, or just spent enough time around teenagers knows, young people are loud and messy. Still, I think I appreciate how Sir John enjoys gathering people for social events, and he perpetually seeks more. Sir John is a character who both welcomes and creates messy situations. He almost seems to become a more energetic and effective version of himself, with a bit of extra noise or another person or two or three in his drawing room. And he also seems to incite a bit of mess for others in what he says and does, but not necessarily in any kind of acrimonious or spiteful way. It's just sort of what he does. He's messy. Let's think through an early example. After Willoughby romantically assists an injured Marianne, the younger Dashwood sister turns to Sir John for information about this dashing young man. When Marianne pushes for details on Willoughby, Sir John adds an anecdote about him dancing from 8 o'clock till 4 without once sitting down, and Marianne quickly becomes intrigued. That is what I like. That is what a young man ought to be. Whatever be his pursuits, his eagerness in them should know no moderation and leave him no sense of fatigue. This is, of course, classic Marianne, and when Sir John hears her express such sentiments, he feels a bit of sympathy or even pain for his much older friend, Colonel Brandon, whom he has already observed admiring the young Dashwood sister. Sir John remarks, "I see how it will be. You will be setting your cap at him now and never think of poor Brandon." Marianne has no tolerance for such language and immediately rebukes. That is an expression, Sir John, which I particularly dislike. I abhor every commonplace phrase by which wit is intended, and setting one's cap at a man or making a conquest are the most odious of all. Their tendency is gross and illiberal, and if their construction could ever be deemed clever, time has long ago destroyed all its ingenuity. Marianne dislikes, no, abhors Sir John's use of cliches, those commonplace phrases that may once have been deemed clever, but have long ago lost their ingenuity. And she makes clear such language is marked by a tendency that is gross and illiberal. I've always adored Marianne, and I'm here to say she's right. Clichés are inevitably hackneyed and tired, often rooted in a context from a distant past or based upon an isolated situation that is lost on most, or more accurately, needs to be explained or even explicated. And when we use clichés, we bring such distant or isolated moments into contact with a specific present. We collapse or squish together one context or historical moment with another. We make a mess of things, messes that can often make for interesting conversations or explanations or images, but messes nonetheless. And yet, this may very well be part of the reason why we continue to use clichés. They help us to capture and synthesize or imagine diverse, even dissonant features of human life, cultural history, and ultimately to voice different kinds of experiences through language. This is quite helpful and often quite creative, but when we do this, especially in language, things get complicated for various reasons. Seeking the attention or pursuing the romantic affection of another is not at all setting one's cap at a man. That cliché makes little or no sense to someone unless you have Sir John's knowledge base or experiences or access to footnotes. For Sir John to provide a useful explanation, he would need time, clarity of thought, historical detail, and likely a bit of patience from Marianne. That's unlikely to happen, especially given the context of the young woman's recent rescue by Willoughby. But Sir John embraces such metaphorical language and all the difficulties it brings. He seems to relish the dissonance of combining images and ideas of conquest, adoration, devotion, desire, and a hat. He seems to flourish in curating and at times creating untidy situations for himself and, unfortunately, at times for others. He may be a minor character in Sense and Sensibility, but I think he embodies a crucial feature of the novel, the messiness of human experiences. Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility is a messy novel, a narrative that specifically captures the messiness of human relationships. Family relationships are tremendously complicated in this story. They're quite confusing from the start and become at times a bit chaotic. And romantic and sexual relationships are tricky and convoluted. And even when they appear to be or become predictable or basic, Austen points to complexities that undergird or even upend such predictability. The novel details how the very ways in which we meet with and develop our relations is inevitably complicated. And all of this involves and has the potential to create greatness. My name is Michael Cramp, and I'm a faculty member in the English department at Lehigh University. And ever since I read Jane Austen at the age of 18, I have been pretty much enamored of her narratives, her characters, and her ideas. While many are repeatedly drawn to Austen for her famous stories of romance, or the quaint settings of her fiction, or her wonderfully witty language, I have found myself returning to Austen as both a scholar and a fan because of the ways in which she treats cultures, people, families, communities, relations, and other human phenomena as complex realities that merit and in turn invite careful, considered, and continual thinking. Austen invites us to keep thinking and keep learning. One of Austen's greatest talents as a writer and a thinker is her ability to convey the mess, the complexity, and the interconnectedness of human life, both clearly and accessibly, in ways that make sense to various kinds of people around the world. In her fiction, Austen does not shy away from difficult situations, financial precarities, marital pressures, war, slavery, imperialism, but also complicated situations that we may categorize as more simple or mundane. Mixed families, mysterious lineages, shifting class positions, the messes of daily life. Difficult and complicating stuff, and Sense and Sensibility is full of difficult scenes, uncomfortable encounters, confusing exchanges, and unexpected arrivals, including a few explicitly unwanted arrivals. Austen shows us this messiness and all the awkwardness, discomfort, and confusion it can bring, but because she writes with such precision, she also helps us to identify, to recognize, and to understand the messiness despite all the mess. Now, I want to be very careful about this point I'm going to try to establish here, so please offer a moment more patience than Marianne Dashwood might. I think the humanities are likewise quite good at creating and conveying messes. But I'm not at all suggesting that the humanities are equivalent to Jane Austen or do what Austen does. That would be foolish. I want to shamelessly leverage Jane Austen to talk about the humanities. I believe Austen can help us communicate the efficacy of the humanities. Jane Austen has an immense talent for clearly documenting, versatilely communicating, and making accessible the messiness, the interrelatedness, and the contingent qualities of human life. The humanities create lots of messes. And when we study the humanities, we learn to ask questions and think through such messes. As teachers, scholars, students, and thinkers, we're quite good at this. Let's revisit the comments of Dr. Robert Newman, the former president of the National Humanities Center, who spoke about, shall we say, the rather untidy, even disruptive tendencies of my colleagues and I within the humanities.
So we in the humanities are kind of, how should I say this, kind of the teenagers of everyday life. We're not comfortable with things. We're always asking why. We're kinds of the pains in the ass of society.
Dr. Newman's comments hit home after reflecting upon Sir John Middleton's fondness for gathering young people for luncheons or private balls. Teenagers ask questions, dismiss easy answers, and often try out new ideas and possibilities without thinking through all the consequences. Teenagers also make mistakes and learn from them. Teenagers get in a bit of trouble. They experiment and explore, often in ways that, as Dr. Newman suggests, can be discomforting or even unnerving. When we study the humanities, as we have discussed previously, we learn to ask new and challenging questions and make connections or bridges between disparate ideas, maybe some connections that may not appear obvious or easy. When we do this, we create some messy situations, often because we refuse to accept neat, orderly, or, quite honestly, convenient explanations. Let's think again about language. We all rely upon language in one way or another to navigate our world, communicate with others, and make sense of confusing situations. In the humanities, I would suggest that we inevitably learn how convenient or simple explanations mask complexities, mask the mess. For example, many of us, and very many incoming university students, have a tendency to imagine and discuss history as homogeneous, as a time back then or in the olden days. This just doesn't work well in the humanities, where we learn, sometimes painfully, that history is not homogeneous. Back then was neither simple nor monolithic. History is full of stops and starts, misunderstandings and confusions, messy families and lovers. And yet, it's so very tempting, perhaps even logical, to create a nostalgic understanding of the past, and then long for this nostalgic time in which the world just seems simpler. We rely on this kind of nostalgia when we curate a quick and easy contrast between today and back then, or the olden days. Again, this is a predictable, if not a logical, maneuver of sorts. We compare or contrast features of the current moment with some almost always unspecified cultural time. For example, before the war, when your grandmother was young, when I was in graduate school, or even better, in those days, whatever that means. When we study disciplines like history or philosophy or the literatures and cultures associated with various languages, we learn that such logic is both insufficient and horribly vague. Quite simply, it doesn't help us to ask meaningful questions or build effective bridges because at least one point on that timeline of our comparison is muddled in unspecified nostalgia. When we study the humanities, we learn that history and religion and culture and language are complex, and the questions that we need to ask and the bridges that we try to build are going to become far more complicated and require more specific engagement. We're going to need time to work through this mess. Human relations and experiences just don't fit all that well into neat or easy generalizations. Austen helps us to see such mess that the humanities invite us to consider. And I think she communicates these messes in ways that we can observe and appreciate. Dr. Mandakini Dubey, faculty member at Ashoka University, spoke with me about this relationship between Austen, the humanities, and messiness.
And that is already a leap, a transformation, a kind of an act of empathy, in a sense, through which I'm able to grasp some understanding. And so in my classroom, for instance, because I teach, novels in the 19th century, we're able to there's so much movement that happens. There's a movement between people, which is, as you said, messy. And then there's a further mess of trying to follow how we think about it. And all this mess is done in the least messy way by somebody like Austen, who uses her language with such precision and with such discipline that there's also something which is very rigorous about it, very precise about it. So I think eventually it becomes a kind of messy wash that we're able to approach with a certain kind of clarity, integrity, rigor. And it's in that, the fact that we're dealing with things which are not objective and which are not out there, but which do require acts of thinking, of intellect, of questioning, of precision, that I think that's something of what the humanities offers.
As Dr. Dubey notes, Austen's precision and rigor allow us to see, dissect, and build connections between all the chaos and confusion of our lived experiences, including the experiences of others in the past. When we read Austen, we become conscious, for example, that we cannot simply homogenize people's thinking or motivations. They are different. They are not mine. When we study the humanities, likewise, we cannot simply collapse this historical time period with that historical time period, or one culture with another. Cliches will need to be unpacked. Explanations will need to be made clear. The dynamics of our relationships cannot be assumed or expressed through aphorisms. In Sense and Sensibility, Austen is particularly adept at showing us the messiness of such human relationships. And let's face it, our relationships get messy, even when they're rooted in love and trust. Our families, our lovers, our friendships are all riddled with complicated and complicating situations and possibilities that can be untidy and at times quite discomforting. I do not mean to suggest that such relationships are somehow bad or unhealthy or toxic in any way. That's certainly not my point. But I think relationships are just inevitably complicated. If we try to hide, cover up, or obfuscate such layers of complication, I think we can run into trouble, especially if we do not appreciate the complexities of others and ourselves. When we recognize the complications of our relationships, we embrace the realities and possibilities of chaos, disruption, surprise, and yes, a bit of mess. I'm certainly happy to be told I'm wrong, but I'm not so sure we always associate the novels of Jane Austen with mess or confusion, but I think we should. My sense is plenty of people look to Jane Austen for a kind of nostalgia, not unlike the nostalgia I was mentioning earlier. Many turn to Austen, no doubt, for relief or as an escape of sorts. Her stories, as the thinking goes, soothe us or provide a respite from the ongoing chaos of our lives, our present. And this may well be true. I would never want to limit the kinds of cultural work that Austen's fiction does. But Austen's stories are just filled with confusion and disarray. In this episode, I want to think more about Austen's ability to show those complications and complexities that lead to mess. She helps us, for example, see what happens when Sir John gathers just a few too many young people, or members of a family leave an issue unresolved for a bit too long, or we don't ask appropriate questions when we make a new acquaintance. Messiness ensues, and then we have to deal with it. And while messy situations can be uncomfortable and awkward, perhaps even painful, they also allow us to see connections and interrelations. Messy moments can be generative, even useful. They prompt us to keep thinking. Again, Dr. Dubey.
And another word for mess is just interconnectedness, right? Everything is connected. and what we call a mess is perhaps things are out of place. But what helps us to understand what place is? Where does it come in? How does it come into being? What is our sense of place? Why is it that everything is interconnected? We could always classify, separate, imagine that, it's as though every axiom is a fantastical act, right? It's like, take such and such to be true. There's imagination that's already built into it. Let us assume. Everything begins with a let us assume. The humanities, and I'm thinking more about literary study at the moment, I think, that when you're talking about literature, we are looking at the act of assumption, the way in which imagination works, how does it all come into being at all? So I find that something worthy of great study and time, no matter what happens, no matter how much AI comes our way.
When we investigate messy situations and experiences, we come to appreciate such interconnections and interrelationships. We question assumptions and axioms that can sanitize or even purify difficult truths or unresolved realities. Assumptions and axioms that can also inhibit open dialogue, hard truths, and yes, a bit of mess. Austen can help with this. One of my least favorite expressions that is often used to tidy up messes or brush aside hard truths is the well-traveled, "it is what it is." I really hate this aphoristic phrase, and it bothers me for two reasons. First, I think it works to deny etiology or origin stories. When we say, well, it just is what it is, we essentially erase the story of how it has become what it is. We deny the story of derivation or evolution, or for that matter, history. In other words, I don't like to believe that things or people just are. We made them, or at times, more accurately, we allowed them to become what they are. We allowed, or maybe we even wanted them to become complicated and interconnected and frustrating, or maybe toxic or destructive. But when we say it is what it is, we actively erase these origin stories. I don't want to do that, and I think the humanities, and most assuredly Austen, help us to appreciate such complexity, often rooted in etiology, history, and interconnection. Second, I think the saying functions hegemonically, and it may be worth taking a moment to reflect on this. When we say it is what it is, we effectively consent to things somehow being or remaining the way they are, which can result in our acceptance of how things were or how things might be in the future. Hegemony is one of those concepts that bounces around college campuses, often showing up in different kinds of courses and conversations. But in my experience, it's rarely actually defined. So here goes. The idea derives from Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist thinker who completed the vast majority of his writings from prison. Gramsci wanted to question and explain why we don't simply revolt against oppressive and domineering structures of power, why we don't eventually, at some point, just wake up or get fed up. And he explains that dominant structures employ various strategies, institutions, and what he terms deputies, such as teachers, religious leaders, and even parents, who entice us to spontaneously consent to be dominated. When hegemonic structures are strong or healthy, they encourage us to nod our heads and consent, say yes, and accept not just that it is what it is, but that for some reason we actually want it to be what it is. We like it. As Radiohead's famous 1997 album warned, when this happens, we say, okay, computer, and move along with our lives, accepting what it is. In the humanities, we're not very good at accepting that it is what it is. And if I'm honest, I think this gets us in a bit of trouble from time to time, especially as higher education has become increasingly politicized. After all, we are the teenagers of society, and I think we should all remember that politicians have explicitly targeted the humanities as a vulnerable area within higher education, as an area they can attack for its methods, subject matter, and impacts. Humanities courses, as the complaints go, rouse dissent, ask and prompt others to ask troubling questions, and even invite discussions on topics like race, sexuality, and culture. Scary stuff, or maybe we should just call it messy stuff. And because the humanities do not accept that it is what it is, students and teachers in the humanities expose the complexities and interconnections that make up our human experiences. We preserve and delineate the richness of our lives. We share the stories, the rituals, and the thought processes that create culture and community. This is a difficult process, and it's especially difficult to communicate such processes effectively. Austen shows us this mess, and she shows it to us with clarity and precision. In Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen specifically shows us the complexities, interconnections, and dynamisms of human relationships. Austen makes no attempt to hide or tidy the mess of family life in Sense and Sensibility. It's quite chaotic right from the start, and she makes clear in her etiology of the Dashwood family that, well, that it is not just what it is. Indeed, this family has become rather complicated. No Jane Austen novel initiates the plot with so many layers of potential confusion as Sense and Sensibility. Austen tells us in the opening lines that the family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large and their residence was at Norland Park, in the center of their property where, for many generations, they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. 2 sentences in, and the narrator appears to be framing a novel around a stable family history. We then read, the late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. This unnamed old man, his sister, and Norland Park serve as our foundation for the family of Dashwood. The sister then promptly dies in the next sentence, resulting in what the narrator terms a great alteration in his home, for to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. New family member, a nephew, and all seems good, as we learn that the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. And while we still don't know the name of the old gentleman who functions as some kind of mythical patriarch, we learn key details about Mr. Henry Dashwood. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had 1 son, by his present lady 3 daughters. We are also told that the son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother. Lots of complications here already. Families merging, former relationships lingering and impacting present and future lives, and as people build new relationships, we are no doubt to experience a bit of mess. And in the next paragraph, the mess begins to get rather intense. Still on page 1, mind you, we find out that the old man, still unnamed, dies, and in his will bequeaths the Norland estate to his nephew's son, and to use Austen's language, his son's son, a child of 4 years old who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle. In a very short space, Austen creates a complex family history and details the future inheritance of an estate that, in all honesty, we just don't deal with much throughout the rest of the novel. But this messy frame story about the Dashwood family informs so much of how we understand family relationships in Sense and Sensibility. The story, of course, revolves around the elder 2 of the 3 daughters of Mr. Henry Dashwood's present lady, about whom it is quite easy to forget as we read this opening bit. Mr. Henry Dashwood, that nephew for whom the old gentleman had earlier sent when his sister died, survives his uncle only 1 12-month, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. The mythical patriarch of Norland Park has now bequeathed his estate through his nephew to his nephew's son, who was born to a woman with whom he is no longer married, who will in turn bequeath the estate to his son, effectively disinheriting the wife and 3 daughters that the mythical patriarch welcomed to Norland Park with his nephew. What a mess. When I spoke with Dr. Olivia Murphy, a Sydney-based Austen scholar, about this novel, she foregrounded this rather muddied opening.
It's interesting because one of the things that I know people struggle with or criticize in Sense and Sensibility is the opening section, where Austen sets out with quite a lot of detail the inheritance and the kinds of patterns of inheritance and why it is that the Dashwoods are being disinherited in that process. And I think that is a deliberately really unstable beginning for a novel. It starts back a generation and then it switches generations and it looks at it's kind of, where are we in time and space? Who are we talking about? Oh, we're being introduced to this place where no one's ever going to live for the rest of the novel, right? And so you're immediately being dislocated, like literally dislocated, and almost like the rug pulled out from under you in terms of thinking about the kinds of traditional things we might associate with Jocelyn. Oh, there's great big house and there's this family in the house and they need to get married, but they lose the house before the novel even really gets going. And I think that then you've got this family which is a female family, right? That has no patriarchal authority in it. And Eleanor, who's 19, her mother is clearly not, or at least from Eleanor's point of view, her mother has abrogated the parental sphere, right? Her mother is not interested in being a parent. There's no father. Eleanor becomes the patriarch of the family, right? Eleanor is the paterfamilias. But she's also supposed to be a marriageable 19-year-old eldest daughter. And so she's fulfilling these two opposed roles, which really, I think, emphasizes the non-normativity of it, right? There aren't these nuclear families. There are these all kinds of other possibilities.
Dr. Murphy was immensely helpful to me in thinking through how this opening story about Norland and an anonymous Dashwood patriarch informs the mess and confusion of family relationships throughout the novel. I really appreciate, for example, Dr. Murphy's reflections on Eleanor's challenge to fulfill both a patriarchal role in what she terms a female family and remain a marriageable 19-year-old. This is an overwhelmingly difficult situation for a young woman. As Dr. Murphy indicates, in this opening to Sense and Sensibility, we sort of get the rug pulled out from under us in terms of our expectations for setting up a traditional novel in a conventional family. We move back and forth in time and space. We establish a history and a future of an estate that, again, we really aren't going to be concerned about for the rest of the novel. Perhaps most importantly, Austen invites us to see the potential and realities of non-normative family life and relations. And all these instabilities and precarities and possibilities inform the story and characters that Austen develops. For example, when Dr. Murphy was talking to me about this opening frame of Sense and Sensibility, she interrupted herself to think about how this confusing story of the Dashwood family affects our broader understanding of identities and relations in the novel.
The other thing that I'm always fascinated by with Sense and Sensibility, which I can't kind of get past, and every time I pick up the book, I come back to the same thing. Every time someone is arriving anywhere in that novel, someone like looks out the window and sees someone coming and thinks, oh, it's so-and-so, and it isn't. It's someone else. Every single time. There's those misrecognitions or missed expectations occur over and over and over again until you get to the point where you almost think that these, human beings are fungible, right? There's this line in it, she is rich and he is he is rich and she is handsome, and that's enough for a wedding, right? This is all you need. It doesn't matter if the people have met each other before. It doesn't matter if they have this, special connection which raises them above the level of everybody else in the community, and their, two hearts finally rejoined in that kind of weird platonic four-armed people, right? Like, it's just, there's got to be a rich man and a handsome woman, and that's it. And it doesn't matter who they are, and you can swap your partners, right? And it begins with the messiness of a blended family, and a really badly blended family. And I think that there's this sense in which Austen is trying to make us very uncomfortable with the idea that there's kind of one destined romantic partner for everybody, or that there's a kind of a fated romantic pairing for every person, because that is not true of anyone in the novel. Everyone's on their second or third go, and it's very it's in thinking about it in the context of other novels of the period, it's really destabilizing.
I'm very interested in Dr. Murphy's ideas about fungibility in Sense and Sensibility, and I think this concept is intimately connected to the messiness of family origins and relationships that we observe throughout the novel. Indeed, this may be part of what it means to live in a big, interconnected, mixed family, or a modernizing, interconnected culture. I know that this concept of fungibility rings true to me as somebody who grew up in a big family. My parents would regularly refer to me using one of my brother's names before landing on Michael. It was sort of routine. It happens. And we were never quite sure who would be around or available for meals or transporting people to school or maybe even sleeping in the house on any given night. We sort of got used to it, adapted to this flux or fungibility, and learned to live with the mess. Perhaps my clearest memory of the sheer messiness of my family was this thing we called the sock basket. Maybe this exists in other families, but I'm really not sure. The sock basket was this repository that, based upon my now distant perspective, seemed to contain pretty much every sock in the Cramp family house. It was both a treasure trove and an absolute disaster. This was where all socks went to live and die, and in a house of 7 kids, we would all feverishly head to the sock basket in search of an elusive matching pair as we readied for school or a game or a dance or whatever. We also quickly learned that socks were rather fungible. I mean, who really cared if socks matched? They were rarely seen and even less frequently scrutinized. Mismatched socks were fine in the Cramp family household. In our big family replete with mess, this was, to be quite honest, rather low on the priority list. And the memory of the sock basket still helps me to think through the messiness of family relationships in Austen and elsewhere. In Sense and Sensibility, we often find characters paired up in odd familial situations, not unlike mismatched socks. In families, we often need to embrace a bit of fungibility, and families challenge us to come to terms with confusing origins and chaotic futures of which at times we have no part in creating and can't really anticipate. Eleanor Dashwood is a prime example of someone who both observes and embraces the mess of a family. As Dr. Murphy notes, she takes on 2 very different roles: the patriarch of the family and a marriageable 19-year-old daughter. As the patriarch, a notably fungible role, she assumes the responsibility of finding a new home for her mother and sisters after the death of their father. She has the unenviable task of managing finances and, perhaps more appropriately, managing her mother, who rather understandably struggles with the realities of downsizing from Norland Park to Barton Cottage. Austen, for example, discusses Mrs. Dashwood's difficult decision to sell their horses and even their carriage. She agreed to sell at the earnest advice of her eldest daughter. For the comfort of her children, had she consulted only her own wishes, she would have kept it. But the discretion of Eleanor prevailed. Her wisdom, too, limited the number of the servants to 3. 2 maids and a man. Before we lose track of things, let's just remember, Mrs. Dashwood, and indeed the entire family, is relying on the wisdom of a 19-year-old young woman who has just lost her father and her home. No pressure. It's probably worth highlighting the complications of this situation. Eleanor is doing her best to economize, act responsibly, and confront the realities of her family's financial situation. 4 women who lack a permanent home or sustainable monetary holdings, and she's a 19-year-old woman who's also supposed to be eligible for marriage. And her mother is not at all that helpful, and she has 2 sisters. Eleanor's relationship with Marianne is the stuff of legends, and nothing I could say here would even begin to capture the complexity and dynamics of their relationship. But we'll try to say something about this in the next segment. I want to end this segment of the episode by thinking about the messiness of the Dashwoods' ongoing familial relationship with Mr. John Dashwood, their brother-in-law, who inherits Norland Park, effectively forcing their removal to Barton. Mr. John Dashwood's wife, Fanny, is also, of course, the sister of Edward Ferrars, the love interest of Eleanor, and Robert Ferrars, whom the Dashwood sisters briefly encounter in London, and who eventually weds Lucy Steele. Austen sets up the makings of a fascinating holiday family dinner table in this novel. As we all know, family is tricky, and it just sort of follows you or stays with you, whether you like it or not. In Sense and Sensibility, Mr. John Dashwood effectively abandons his sisters and mother-in-law and then reinserts himself in their lives as he sees fit. and in rather unexpected and awkward ways, reminding us of the fungibility of which Dr. Murphy spoke. Marianne and Eleanor run into him at Mr. Gray's shop in London, the same shop where they observed Mr. Robert Ferris obsessively detailing toothpick cases. Mr. John Dashwood offers pleasantries. I wished very much to call upon you yesterday, but it was impossible. But tomorrow I think I shall certainly be able to call. I really love how Austen handles this moment. She allows Mr. John Dashwood to perform his pleasantries, make his excuses, and then provides us with Eleanor's inner thoughts. Eleanor did feel a little ashamed of her brother, and was not sorry to be spared the necessity of answering him by the arrival of Mrs. Jennings' servant, who came to tell her that his mistress waited for them at the door. Despite Mr. John Dashwood's decision to neglect his father's deathbed request to care for his relations, he still performs as a member of their family, and Eleanor still recognizes him as her brother. He soon attends to them in London, where they are staying with Mrs. Jennings, whom he understands is a woman of very good fortune. And as Austen tells us, his visit was duly paid. And when he attempts to offer an apology for his wife's inability to join him, Mrs. Jennings assured him directly that she should not stand upon ceremony, for they were all cousins or something like it. Austen's language again points to something of the confusion or fungibility surrounding relations amongst the Dashwoods. According to the narrator, Mr. John Dashwood's manners were perfectly kind, and when Colonel Brandon enters the room, he eyed him with a curiosity which seemed to say that he only wanted to know him to be rich to be equally civil to him. As Mr. John Dashwood makes his exit after half an hour, he requests Eleanor to walk with him and quickly congratulates her on the prospect of a very respectable establishment in life, quickly arriving at the conclusion that Colonel Brandon has developed a fondness for Eleanor that will directly lead to a proposal of marriage. His patronizing advice is worth quoting. A very little trouble on your side secures him. The smallness of your fortune may make him hang back. His friends may all advise against it, but some of those little attentions and encouragements which ladies can so easily give will fix him, in spite of himself. It's always good to have a brother who knows so little about his sister, has effectively disowned her mother, and siblings, but is still willing to offer patronizing and demeaning guidance. Family relations can be trying and difficult and discomforting. People can neglect us and then reappear. And I think it would be a significant mistake if we simply approach these kinds of situations and announce, it is what it is, or that just sucks, or he's a jerk. These sorts of quick conclusions, like Mr. John Dashwood's quick conclusion, may be neat and tidy, but they mask the complications of family life and relations, complications that Austen sets up on the opening page of the novel and helps us to see with clarity and precision throughout the narrative. Mr. John Dashwood can act like a jerk, and he can be insecure and weak-minded and presumptuous. And apparently the anonymous old gentleman, the Norland Park patriarch, sort of liked him and his son. He understands the burden of family and the propriety that comes with this, especially as he balances a blended family. Mrs. Dashwood can appear short-sighted and overly emotional, even rather immature. And she understands the precarity of her daughters, acts with tenderness at times, and balances grief with dignity. But far more importantly, Austen allows us to observe such behavior, complexities and all. Austen shows us the challenges Eleanor endures as she navigates obnoxious brothers, emotional sisters, and prying aunts and uncles. Austen helps us understand that such relationships are part of family life. They're complex. They have histories, and they involve and will continue to involve confusing circumstances. When we read Austen, we see this. And the Humanities teach us to appreciate, not to cover up or dismiss, the mess of family relationships. In Sense and Sensibility, family relations may get tricky. Love relations in the novel can be downright bewildering. Jane Austen is, of course, renowned for her stories of love and romance, and while she's not a conventional romance writer, that's for another time and place. What is undeniably true is that she has made massive contributions to how we tell and understand stories of love, desire, and romance, and she shows us the complications of love. Love is absolutely messy. It's unsettling and at times disruptive, maybe even revolutionary. This is one of the many reasons why arranged marriages, dating apps, and marital guidance books are so tremendously popular around the globe. They help us order or clean up the messiness of love and desire that can be so tricky and get us all in so much trouble. Soniah Kamal, the Pakistani-American author of Unmarriageable, a post-colonial retelling of Pride and Prejudice, spoke with me about the potential hazards and the legitimate possibility for upheaval associated with love, especially when it interferes with the business of marriage.
Love is lovely. And even in Austen's time, people running off to, where would they run off to? Scotland, I think, to get married and stuff, because love upturned the whole business of marriage. Love is the opposite of business. So when those two clash, naughty things can happen.
In Sense and Sensibility, Austen shows us this messiness, precarity, even potential naughtiness of love in full force. Dr. Claudia L. Johnson, Murray Professor of English at Princeton University, spoke to me at length about both the confusion surrounding love relationships in the narrative that precipitates such messiness and how the novel helps us to come to terms with the very hazards of desire.
I think you're right, though in all of Austen's novels, I think it's fair to say that relationships are messy. But in Sense and Sensibility, they're particularly messy because the principal characters in it, who are women, are not in a position to know what they need to know about the men that they love. You know, they don't even know that they don't know about these people. And just to give a little plot summary, Marianne gives all of her heart's desire and trust to Willoughby, but she has no knowledge, and no one does, that he actually has a prior relationship, that he has previously seduced and abandoned a young woman, and that woman has had a child by him, who presumably is there at the end of the, of the novel, and that so how can she make a judgment about falling in love with Willoughby without having had that knowledge? And then, even while he's courting her, he finally ditches her to marry, a woman with a lot of money, which certainly Marianne doesn't have. So again, what relationship couldn't be a mess if it is if it has to unfold in such darkness? And it's not Marianne who's deluded. It's not because she is excessive. It's because nobody knows about this, and everybody thinks that he is sincere, and maybe he is sincere. Now, then we have the same precise thing happening with Eleanor, who's in love with a man who seems to be, encouraging their relationship, but who also has a previous attachment which she doesn't know about and is not in a position to kind of, assess in controlling or developing her feelings. How do you know what you want? How do you know whom to want? How do you know whom to trust? How do you know how to manage your emotional life in conditions such as these? So what I remember really learning from this novel, way before I discussed it as a scholar, is that yearning can be dangerous. That desire can be dangerous. And this is a striking novel in that a character almost dies. That Marianne is sort of on the brink of death, and that she's brought back from that. That sort of results from giving your heart so trustingly without knowledge.
Dr. Johnson says a ton here, so let's just point to a few key issues. So much of the memorable mess of both Marianne and Eleanor's romantic relations is tied to their fundamental lack of knowledge. They just don't know enough or at the right times. And as Dr. Johnson astutely points out, they don't even know that they don't know, setting them up to experience surprising and painful discoveries. In Austen's novel, this makes for some truly discomforting moments, especially, as Dr. Johnson notes, when both sisters learn that their love interests are, or more accurately, have been engaged with others. But they didn't know this, and we didn't know this, reminding us that love relations can involve a bit of mystery, risk, and precarity. To desire or yearn, as Dr. Johnson suggests, is rather dangerous. It exposes our vulnerabilities. And remember, Sense and Sensibility is an Austen novel in which a young female lover endures a severe sickness that threatens her life. Love relations in Sense and Sensibility are not the stuff of light beach romance reading. When we love or pursue love relations, we are, of course, inevitably vulnerable because we always lack definitive knowledge. We are in the process of learning about another and maybe a bit about ourselves as we come to terms with ourselves as a lover and as one who is loved. Again, Dr. Johnson.
But here Austen really zooms in on how we are obliged to kind of conduct our emotional lives in what Locke once called the twilight of probability. These things may be true, but we don't know that they're true.
As readers and rereaders of Austen, it's tempting to become enamored with her love stories and villainize people who obstruct romance or become frustrated with heroes and heroines who don't know enough to enjoy some ideal of love. But as with most features of Austen's work, it's a bit more complicated. And Austen's treatments of Eleanor and Marianne may help us to appreciate some of these complications and risks that undergird love relationships. When we read Sense and Sensibility, it's all too easy to embrace the title's invitation to pair the heroines and chart their character arcs accordingly. But Austen helps us to recognize that love relationships are fundamentally more complex. I've always been amused by Eleanor's very disciplined attempt to discuss her emerging affection for Edward Ferrars with her mother and Marianne. One of my favorite moments is when Austen reports how Eleanor tried to explain the real state of the case to her sister. I do not attempt to deny that I think very highly of him, that I greatly esteem him, that I like him. Marianne here burst forth with indignation. Esteem him, like him, cold-hearted Eleanor. Oh, worse than cold-hearted, ashamed of being otherwise. Use those words again and I will leave the room this moment. We can no doubt think about this exchange as a prime example of the sense and sensibility of the novel's title. Eleanor seems so careful and reserved, and Marianne appears overtaken with feeling and intolerant of moderation. But it's also helpful to consider how a memorable scene like this points to Eleanor's understanding of the potential messiness surrounding her early relationship with Edward. And keep in mind, as Dr. Johnson made clear, Eleanor knows so very little. This is going to get much, much messier. Still, she knows that Edward is the brother of her brother-in-law's wife, Fanny. She knows that Fanny has indicated how their mother has high expectations for Edward. She knows that, to borrow the ideas of Sonia Kamal, she does not represent a good financial investment in the business of marriage. Eleanor has good reason to be cautious, to guard herself as she manages or negotiates the possible volatility of a love relationship that could be. She understands that her fondness for Edward could get messy quite quickly, even if she doesn't know yet just how messy and painful it will become. If we abide by neat or easy explanations, we're tempted to talk about Eleanor as that sister who holds it all together, who recognizes dangers, precarities, and instabilities before they become too big or threatening. But Austen also shows us how Eleanor's engagement with love relations can also be a bit of a mess. And let's face it, as a 19-year-old woman who has lost her father, her home, and been forced to serve as the patriarch of a non-normative family effectively dependent upon the kindness of strangers, she's got plenty of opportunities to experience a bit of disarray. And as Eleanor acquires more knowledge surrounding Edward Ferrars and his prior engagement with Lucy Steele, she no doubt comes face to face with the dangers and pains of desire of which Dr. Johnson spoke. Later, in one of the novel's climactic moments, When Edward comes to Barton bringing knowledge that Lucy Steele has married his brother Robert Ferrars, Austen tells us that his words were echoed with unspeakable astonishment by all but Eleanor, who sat with her head leaning over her work in a state of such agitation as made her hardly know where she was. Austen soon adds, Eleanor could sit it no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy, which at first she thought would never cease. For all Eleanor's composure and control, her experiences of love and desire overwhelm her. And no proposal has taken place, mind you. Ultimately, she's just acquiring more knowledge here. She has gone from an evolving relationship with Edward to realizing that he's long been engaged to Lucy Steele, to discovering that Lucy has now opted to wed Edward's brother. Dr. Johnson is correct that when we lack fundamental knowledge about our relationships, we find ourselves in challenging and confusing situations. And even as Eleanor achieves clarity of understanding, we see how experiencing love with another is still rather messy, overpowering, maybe even uncontrollable. I spoke with Maan Jalal, a Dubai-based writer and journalist, about this scene, and he recalled a memorable encounter with his thesis advisor.
She didn't want that messiness to come in, but then, I always think about her reaction, right? When at the end, when Edward Ferrars comes and the truth is revealed and she kind of breaks down, right? In the novel. You know what's so interesting? I remember, because I had read Sensibility when I was younger, and then there was a couple of years where I didn't read it, and I was mixing up the novel with the bunch of adaptations, and I was sitting with my supervisor for my master's, and we were actually talking about Sensibility and how it relates to Eye of the Garden. And he was like, but the film is terrible. It's such a terrible film. And I was like, why is that? He's like, because that breakdown she has at the end, that's not Austen. That's something that Emma Thompson put in the screenplay. And I was like, is it? And I couldn't remember. And he was like, Austen's all about, not going to show your feelings. She's not going to get messy like that. And it stuck in my head. And I was like, that must have been a scene that Emma Thompson added. But then going back and reading, I was like, no, he was wrong. Austen put in that breakdown of the facade and that messiness coming out and realizing all this pent-up emotion she was holding and this control.
I think it's really important to reflect, as Maan Jalal invites us to do, on Eleanor's surprising emotional response in this scene. Eleanor has been through so very much in this novel and successfully managed so very many vulnerabilities and precarities. This is a moment in which we can observe the chaos, confusion, and joy of love, of her love relation with another. As I mentioned earlier, I'm always happy to be told I'm wrong, but I've never found this scene beautiful or romantic or even touching. I think it's really messy and even somewhat disturbing. Eleanor is agitated and disoriented. She has to leave the room. The joy or pleasure or relief is too much for her. It overwhelms and exposes her, reminding us of the risks and hazards of love. In this episode, I wanted to foreground Eleanor in many ways because I think it's tempting to focus on Marianne as the overwhelmed and vulnerable lover who becomes sick and nearly dies. Unlike her supposedly disciplined sister, Marianne seems to throw herself into the dangers of love relationships, and she defends herself early in the novel when discussing her initial encounters with Willoughby. Is this fair? Is this just? Are my ideas so scanty? I have been open and sincere where I ought to have been reserved, spiritless, dull, and deceitful. Had I talked only of the weather and the roads, and had I spoken only once in 10 minutes, this reproach would have been spared. Marianne mocks the very expectation or caution or discretion in love. And one of the standard approaches to this novel has been to emphasize how the younger sister learns to temper her approach to love relations, especially following her near-death illness. This is neither the time nor the place to debate traditional approaches to Austen's stories. Instead, I want to stay focused on how Sense and Sensibility allows us to appreciate the messiness of relations, a messiness that, as Dr. Johnson emphasized, is rooted in the heroine's lack of knowledge. Marianne, of course, does not know that Willoughby has been involved with Eliza, the daughter of Colonel Brandon's former love interest, and his own brother, also an Eliza. And Willoughby then fathers a child with the aforementioned Eliza, another Eliza. Note how Austen repeats a messy etiology and family lineage that quickly becomes difficult to track. families and lineages can get rather complicated and confused by the dangers of love and desire. And Austen makes clear how the legitimate threat to Marianne's life is rooted in dangerous love and dangerous lovers. It is again tempting to chastise Marianne for her reckless love and then view her recovery from illness as some kind of maturation or learning process. But as with many situations in Austen's novels, I think this would oversimplify the complexities. And Austen, like the Humanities, invites us to complicate and think through complexity. Willoughby is a scoundrel who abandons women, neglects responsibilities, and acts with extreme selfishness. And he is alarmingly nostalgic. Indeed, his behavior reminds us of the dangers of nostalgia that we discussed in the opening of the podcast. When discussing possible improvements or alterations to Barton Cottage, he memorably announces, "Not a stone must be added to its walls, not an inch to its size, if my feelings are regarded." He soon asks of Mrs. Dashwood, "Tell me that not only your house will remain the same, but that I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling." His request is, of course, quite ridiculous. He expresses a desire to suspend time and suspend his relations with others, perhaps reminding us of a first-year college student who has a rather homogeneous view of the past. Willoughby clings to a nostalgic view of the Dashwood home and family. He wants to fix their evolution and simplify his relationships with them. This sentiment is also quite selfish, and Austen, of course, shows us the impossibility of his wish. Relationships with others and our world are complex. People grow up. Love happens. Mess and all. We must evolve. When I spoke to Dr. Meenakshi Bharat, a Delhi-based scholar, about Sense and Sensibility, she spoke about this messiness from a different perspective that I found quite helpful.
It's not simple, yeah. And I think what Jane Austen, her texts, and especially Sense and Sensibility, the way the text actually moves is towards saying that, it talks about the messiness of life, but its final, the final gleaning that I get from the text is that life will be messy, life ought to be messy if it has to be full. That's what I get out of Jane Austen, that she seems to be almost, some kind of a propagator of the idea of messiness in life.
Yes, life is messy. Yes, messes are complicated. And messes, as Dr. Bharat notes, also make our life rich and full. Austen shows us this. When Willoughby voices his childish desire to freeze time and adheres to a foolish nostalgia, he also exposes his inability to embrace the fullness of life and its various complications, including the complications of others. He is unable to handle such messiness. He makes awful choices that not only hurt others, but prevent him from developing more sincere relations that embrace such diversity and complexity. Willoughby causes tremendous pain and sorrow in the novel, and I think it's worth returning to the story of Eliza, or perhaps more accurately, the stories of Elizas. When I spoke with Dr. Claudia L. Johnson about this moment, I acknowledged that I've never really been able to come to terms with this subplot of Sense and Sensibility, a subplot in which the fate of the third Eliza is never made clear.
It's messy, but it's also haunting. Who do you think is supporting? Is that the third Eliza, by the way? And it must be that Marianne, a.k.a. Mrs. Brandon, is supporting her, is supporting the illegitimate offspring, is supporting Willoughby's illegitimate daughter.
Yeah, I guess we just don't know.
You don't know.
Yeah.
But I think we are entitled to infer that she's living at the end of the novel.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
again, I think that was the part of the novel as a young reader that I never wrapped my mind around.
The fact that we never heard from her again. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's sort of not altogether mentionable in polite society, is it?
This minor storyline of Austen's novel is haunting, and Dr. Johnson is most assuredly right that it's just not altogether mentionable in polite society. Austen leaves us with this unresolved mess. She does not provide a tidy resolution or allow us to sweep the dust behind the door. And as I mentioned earlier, she shows us the etiology or origin story of this mess. It is not and never was just what it is. This technique or method is central to the humanities. Like Austen, the humanities do not shy away from messy situations, even messes that may not be altogether mentionable in polite society. And again, I think that gets us in trouble from time to time. Human relationships get tricky and complicated and convoluted. Austen helps us to see such messes with clarity and precision, to embrace the mess as integral to our human lives. As we close this episode, I want to return to Dr. Mandakini Dubey, who spoke with me about this linkage between Austen, the humanities, and the challenge of conveying stories and information with precision, especially when our politically extremist cultures favor vague explanations, manufactured simplicity, or trite aphorisms.
I think that Austen has such uncompromising, exquisite discrimination, and she's so precise about motivations and about people's thinking that if you actually pay attention, it's sort of the opposite of fake news, you know? It's the opposite of propaganda. It's the opposite of manipulating information, because we're always being invited to consider what is really happening in all its specificity, in all its precision. So when you start paying attention and when you start thinking in that uncompromising way about not just other people's motivations, but your own, and not just, and why is it that I want to believe this? Currently in India, there's a sort of a spread of misinformation. It's a strange time when the humanities are under some stress, and at the same time, science is under stress too. You know, at the moment where the Indian government is very happy to sort of fan the flames of ethnic hostility or religious communitarian hostility, communal hostility, by thinking about, where such and such mythical king was born and, what flying instruments were invented in India in the Vedic age, and so on and so forth. So it's supposedly, on the one hand, we have this push towards science, engineering, commerce, and on the other hand, everything that's being spoken of requires an understanding of ideology, requires an understanding of I suppose, symbolic meaning, because that's what's being used so much. So it's a time when the humanities are really important and necessary, and also at the same time they're under stress. So somebody like Austen allows you, I think, a way to have conversations, for example, in the classroom, which can push back against that easy acceptance of what is told to you. Even if she's doing it at the level of personal motivations, it has implications. It makes you a better reader of text in general.
I really love how Dr. Dubey invites us to think about Jane Austen as the opposite of fake news. And I think her words are helpful in coming to terms with the messiness of human relations. Austen's precision allows her both to show complexity and make this complexity accessible and clear. She does not shy away from confusion or noise. Like Sir John, she seems to welcome such messes. Life in Austen is messy, and no facile explanation will tidy up. When we read Austen, we observe the challenges and precarities of human relations. The humanities likewise challenge us to embrace these complications, to see the world as dynamic and diverse. It's striking to think, as Dr. Dubey suggests, how political and cultural leaders use and have long used humanistic methods and strategies to craft popular understandings of history, manipulate our sense of cultural community, and curate an artificial vision of a racialized national people. There is great potential in core humanistic practices such as storytelling, ritual, and historical chronicling, a potential that has been misused or deployed to achieve harmful and divisive ends. In the humanities, we take seriously such features of human experiences and their various potentials. They help us to make meaning, build relations with others, and make sense of our messy lives. And we recognize how these methods can also be used to mask complexity, misrepresent the heterogeneity of the past, and install fissures between individuals and communities. Austen, like the humanities, encourages us to engage complexity and deal with the mess. Austen is not a politician, and I've never identified any grand vision for a future culture in her novels, but like any brilliant thinker, she invites us to ask questions and reflect upon possibilities. Whenever I read Austen, I find myself returning to a fundamental question. Why have so many turned and continue to turn to Austen's fiction as a respite, a tonic of sorts, or even a source of supposed calm, a supposed escape from the mess of their lives? I am most assuredly not the only person to ask this question. We know the famous accounts of Austen's stories being prescribed for World War I soldiers suffering from shell shock and read by many on the home front and in battle. We know that Austen's world remains alluring as a site of romance. We know that many continue to look for Austen for guidance on various aspects of their life, including family and dating and general happiness. I think the assumption that underlies all of this is that Austen offers us simplicity, a clean or tidy vision to which we cling when our lives get messy. But as we have discussed today, Austen shows us a world that is quite messy. She lived in a messy world replete with war and sickness, imperialism and death, as well as the complicated realities of family and love. And as we have seen, she writes about a messy world. People around the world continue to look to Austen. Her fiction and various adaptations remain wildly popular and a source of diverse comforts. And while it may sound strange to some, I have now come to believe that one of the foundational reasons for Austen's lure is her ability to show us disorder and confusion with clarity and precision. She doesn't mask messiness. It's right there on the opening pages of Sense and Sensibility. We see the confusion, the disarray, even the discomfort. Unlike politicians or cultural leaders who promote different iterations of fake news or curate stories designed to advance a designated ideology or just lie about the mess, Austen shows us a mess that we can observe. She depicts people like Sir John who may talk a bit too much, use hackneyed or crass language, and gather together too many young people. She describes complicated origin stories of families, relations, and recalls experiences of former lovers that can be painful. She recounts the dangerous trials of Marianne, and she allows even figures like Willoughby, to borrow Eleanor's words, to prove yourself on the whole less faulty than I had believed you, to prove your heart less wicked, much less wicked. Facile and trite explanations are hard to come by in Jane Austen's world. Francine Mathews, the author of the long-standing Jane Austen mystery series, spoke to me about Austen in terms of survival.
Austen endures because so many people go to her to understand how to survive. She teaches a class a master class in human survival, and that's why her stories have, I think, persisted over multiple centuries, because she teaches us these authentic truths about how to live, how to love, how to lose, how to die.
Human relations and experiences can be a bit of a challenge, and Austen, as Mathews notes, shows us this complexity. When we see the mess for what it is, I'm convinced we gain understanding and perspective, including perspective on how to survive amidst the challenges and complexities. We learn and continue to think. As Austen shows us, we will need to continue to think and learn if we are going to survive. And while Austen continues to enjoy vast global appeal, the humanities within higher education are experiencing massive cuts to funding, staffing, and research. Like Austen, the humanities show us the mess of our lives and experiences, and sometimes this is disturbing or discomforting, or even painful. But the world is just not what it is. It merits study and scrutiny if we are to survive, address pressing global problems, and develop new, meaningful relationships. And when we engage in such careful study, we learn to embrace the complexity and the mess, rather than to turn away from it or sanitize it or obscure it with fake news. In the next episode of Jane Austen, The Future of the Humanities, we turn our attention to Austen's most beloved novel, Pride and Prejudice, a narrative adored for its love story and heroine, but we will discuss how Pride and Prejudice demonstrates a different and vital humanities experience, the inevitability of change. In Austen's second published novel, she points to significant cultural shifts and developments that will usher in changes for many, whether we like it or not. This next episode will be available at the end of September. I hope you will join me.